Unit 9 Dependency Theory of Underdevelopment. Contents 9.1 Introduction, 9.2 Dependency Theory, the beginning, 9.3 How can one define dependency theory, 9.4 Structural context of dependency, is it capitalism or is it power, 9.5 Central propositions of dependency theory, 9.6 the policy implications of dependency analysis, 9.7 critics of dependency theory, 9.8 relevance of dependency theories, 9.9 dependency theory and overview, 9.10 conclusion, 9.11 further reading. Learning objectives. In this chapter you will be critically analyze and evaluate the contributions of dependency theories, dependency theory as articulation of the poorer nations, and relevance and critique of dependency theory. 9.1 Introduction. The units of Block 2 familiarized us with the different perspectives on development, such as modernization theories and liberal, Marxian and Gandhian perspectives of development. Now let us turn to the theories that generated as a response to growth model of development. The present unit deals with the dependency theory, which was developed as a critique of Western-oriented development model. Dependency theories were one of the strongest critics of growth-oriented theories, which came largely from Western nations. The dependency theory, which came from the Latin American world in that sense, is critique, which was from the south of the richer north. There are minor variations between the theories. What will be attempt in this unit is to try and present the core essential features of dependency theories. We will also examine dependency theories for the implications it has on economics of third world countries and whether it has any relevance to present economic disparities between the richer northern nations and the poorer southern nations. 9.2 Dependency Theory, the beginning. Dependency theory developed in the late 1950s under the guidance of the director of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, Raul Prebisch. Prebisch and his colleagues were troubled by the fact that the economic growth in the advanced industrialist countries did not necessarily lead to the growth of the poorer countries. Indeed, their studies suggested that the economic activities in the richer countries often led to serious economic problems in the poorer countries. Such a possibility was not predicted by the neoclassical theory, which had assumed that the economic growth was beneficial to all, even if the benefits were not always equally shared. Prebisch's initiation explanation for the phenomena was very straightforward. Poorer countries exported primary commodities to the richer countries, who then manufactured the products out of those commodities and sold them back to the poorer countries. The value added by manufacturing a usable product always cost more than the primary products used to create those products. Therefore, poorer countries would never be earning enough for their export earning to pay for their imports. Prebisch's solution was similarly straightforward. Poorer countries should embark on programs of import substitution so that they need not purchase the manufactured products from the richer countries. The poorer countries would still sell their primary products on the world market, but their foreign exchange reserves would not be used to purchase their manufactures from abroad. Three issues made this policy difficult to follow. The first is that the internal markets of the poorer countries were not large enough to support the economies of the scale used by the richer countries to keep their prices low. The second issue concerned the political will of the poorer countries as to whether a transformation from being primary products producers was possible or desirable. The final issue was revolved around the extent to which the poorer countries actually had control over their primary products, particularly in the area of selling those products abroad. These obstacles to the import substitutions policy led others to think a little more creatively and historically at the relationship between rich and poor countries. At this point, dependency theory was viewed as a possible way of explaining the persistent poverty of the poorer countries. The traditional neoclassical approach said virtually nothing on this question except to assert that the poorer countries were late in coming to sound economic practices and that as soon as they learned the techniques of modern economics, their poverty would begin to subside. However, Marxist theorists viewed the persistent poverty as a consequence of capitalist exploitation, and a new body of thought called the world systems approach argued that The poverty was a direct consequence of the evolution of the international policy economy into a fair, rigid division of labor which favored the rich and penalized the poor. 9.3 How can one define dependency theory? The debates among the liberals, reformers, Prebisch, the Marxist, Andergunder, Frank, and the world systems theorist Wallerstein was vigorous and intelligently quite challenging. There are still points of serious disagreement among the various strains of dependency theorists, and it is a mistake to think that there is only one unified theory of dependency. Nonetheless, there are some core positions which seems to underline the analysis of most dependency theorists. Dependency can be defined as an explanation of economic development of a state in terms of the external influence, political, economic, or cultural on national development policies. Teotonio dos Santos emphasizes the historical dimensions of dependency relationship in his definition. Dependency is a historical condition which shapes a certain structure of the world economy such that it favors some countries to the detriment of others and limits the development possibilities of the subordinate economics. A situation in which the country economy of a certain group of countries is conditioned by the development and expansion of another economy to which their own is subjected. There are three common features to these definitions which mostly dependency theorists share. First, dependency characteristic of internal system as comprised of two sets of states, variously described as dominant, dependent, center, periphery, or metropolitan or satellite. The dominant states are the advanced industrial nations in organization of economic cooperation and development. The dependent states are those states of Latin America and Asia and Africa which have low per capita GNPs and which rely heavily on the export of single commodity or a few commodities for foreign exchange earnings. Second, both definitions have in common the assumptions that the external forces are of singular importance to the economic activities within the dependent state. These external forces include multinational corporation, international commodity mistakes, foreign assistance, communications, and any other means by which the advanced industrialized countries can represent their economic interest abroad. Third, all the definition of dependency indicate that the relations between the dominant and dependent states are dynamic because the interactions between the two sets of states tend not only reinforce but also intensify the unique patterns. Moreover, dependency is a very deep-seated historical process rooted in the internationalization of capitalism. Latin America today has been since the 16th century a part of an international system dominated by the present developed nations. Underdevelopment in Latin America is the outcome of a particular series of relationships to the international system. Box 9.1 World Systems Theory. In the 1960s, international financial and trade systems were beginning to be more flexible, in which the national government seems to have less and less influence. These were the new conditions under which the Third World was trying to elevate its standards of living. It is this which made people like Immanuel Wallerstein conclude that there are new activities in the capitalistic world economy which cannot be explained by old theories. This school originated in Fernand Braudel Center for Study of Economics at the State University of New York at Binghamton. Having organized in sociology, is extended its impact to anthropology, history, political science. Wallerstein and his followers felt that there were wider forces in the world that impacted and influenced smaller and underdeveloped nations, and the nation-state level of analysis is no longer useful to explain conditions under developed countries. The factors that had greatest influence on small countries were new global systems of communication, the new world trade mechanism, the international financial system, and transfer of military links. These factors have created their own dynamics at the international level, and at the same time, these elements are interacting with the internal aspects of each country. In short, dependency theory attempts to explain the present underdeveloped state of many nations in the world by examining the patterns of interactions among nations and by arguing that Equality among nations is an intrinsic part of these interactions. Reflections and Actions 9.1. Read the box on the world system theory carefully and answer the following questions. Can we explain underdevelopment and development in purely economic terms? Do you agree with the world system theory that world is interconnected and therefore underdevelopment is in one nation can explained in terms of series of factors which affect them that are located elsewhere? Explain with a suitable example. 9.4 Structural context of dependency. Is it capitalism or is it power? Most dependency theorists regard international capitalism as the motive force behind dependency theory relationships. Andre Gunder Frank, one of the earliest dependency theorists, is quite clear on this point. Historical research demonstrates that the contemporary underdevelopment is in large part of historical product of past and continuing economic and other relations between the satellite underdeveloped and the now developed metropolitan countries. Furthermore, those relationships are an essential part of the capitalist system on a world scale as a whole. According to this view, the capitalist system has enforced and rigid international division of labor which is responsible for the underdevelopment of many areas of the world. The dependent states supply cheap minerals, agriculture commodities and cheap labor and also serve as the repositories of surplus capital, obsolescent technologies and manufactured goods. These functions orient the economies of dependent states towards the outside. Money, goods and services do flow into dependent states, but the allocation of these resources are determined by the economic interest of the dominant states and not by the economic interest of the dependent state. This division of labor is ultimately the explanation for poverty, and there is little question but that capital regards the division of labor as a necessary condition of the efficient allocation of resources. The most explicit manifestation of this characteristic is in the doctrine of comparative advantage. Moreover, to a large extent, the dependency models result upon the assumption that the economic and political power are heavily concentrated and centralized in the industrialized countries, an assumption shared with Marxist theories of imperialism. If this assumption is valid, then any distinction between economic and political power is spurious. Governments will take whatever steps are necessary to protect private economic interests, such as those held by multinational companies. Not all dependency theorists, however, are Marxist, and one should clearly distinguish between dependency and theory of imperialism. The Marxist theory of imperialism explained dominant state expansion, while the dependency theory explained underdevelopment. Stated another way, Marxist theories explain the reasons why imperialism occurs, while dependency theories explain the consequences of imperialism. The difference is significant. In many aspects, imperialism is, for a Marxist, part of the process by which the world is transformed and is therefore a process which accelerates the communist revolution. Marx spoke approvingly of British colonization in India. England has to fulfill a double mission in India, one destructive, the other regenerating, the annihilation of old Asiatic society and the laying of the material foundation of Western society in Asia. For the dependency theorist, the underdevelopment is a wholly negative condition which offers no possibility of sustained and autonomous economic activity in a dependent state. Additionally, the Marxist theory of imperialism is self-liquidating, while the dependent relationship is self-perpetuating. The end of imperialism in the Leninist framework comes about as the dominant powers go to war over a rapidly shrinking number of exploitable opportunities. World War I was, for the Lenin, the classic proof of this proposition. After the war was over, Britain and France took over the former German colonies. The dependency theorist rejects this proposition. A dependent relationship exists irrespective of the specific identity of the dominant state. That the dominant states may fight over this position of dependent territories is not in and of itself a pertinent bit of information, except the periods of fighting among dominant states afford opportunities for the dependent states to break their dependent relationships. To a dependency theorist, the central characteristic of global economy is the persistence of poverty throughout the entire modern period in virtually the same areas of the world, regardless of what state was in control. Finally, there are some dependency theorists who do not identify capitalism as the motor force behind a dependency relationship. The relationship is maintained by a system of powers first, and it does not seem as if power is only supported by capitalism. For example, the relationship between the former dependent states in the socialistic bloc, the Eastern European states and Cuba, for example, closely parallel the relationship between poorer states and the advanced capitalist states. The possibility that dependency is more closely linked to disparities of power rather than to the particular characteristic of a given economic system is intriguing and consistent with the more traditional analysis of international relations such as realism. 9.5 The central propositions of dependency theory. There are a number of propositions, all of contestable, which forms the core of the dependency theory. These propositions include 1. Underdevelopment is a condition fundamentally different from undevelopment. The latter term simply refers to a condition in which resources are not being used. For example, the European colonies viewed the North American continent as an undeveloped area. The land was not underdeveloped. Refers to a constitution. The land was not actively cultivated on a scale of consistent with its potential. Underdevelopment refers to a situation in which the resources are being actively used, but used in a way which benefits dominant state and not the poorer states in which the resources are found. The distinction between underdevelopment and undevelopment places the poorer countries of the world in a profoundly different historical context. These countries are not behind or catching up with the richer countries of the world. They are not poorer because they are lagged behind the scientific transformation or the enlightenment values of the European state. They are poorer because they are cohesively integrated into European economic system only as a producer of raw materials or to serve as a repositories of cheap labor, and were denied the opportunity to market their resources in any way that competed with the dominant state. The dependency theorists suggest that alternative uses of resources are preferable to the resources usage patterns imposed by dominant state. There is no clear definition of what these preferred patterns might be, but some criteria are evoked. For example, one of the dominant state practices most often criticized by dependency theorists is export agriculture. The criticism is that many poorer economies experience rather higher rates of malnutrition even though they produce greater amounts of food for export. Many dependency theorists would argue that those agricultural lands should be used for domestic food production in order to reduce the rates of malnutrition. The preceding proposition can be amplified as follows. Dependency theorists rely upon a belief that there exists a clear national economic interest which can and should be articulated for each country. In this respect, dependency theory actually shares a similar theoretical concern with realism. What distinguishes the dependency perspective is that its proponents believe that this nationalist interest can only be satisfied by addressing the needs of the poorer within a society rather than the satisfaction of corporate or governmental needs. Trying to determine what is the best for the poorer is a difficult analytical problem. Dependency theorists have not yet articulated an operational definition on the national economic interest. The division of resources over time, and one must remember that dependency relationships have persisted since the European expansion beginning in the 15th century, is maintained not only by the power of dominant state, but also through the power of elites in the dependent states. Dependency theorists argue that these elites maintain a dependent relationship between their own private interest coincide with the interest of dominant state. These elites are typically trained in the dominant states and share similar values and culture with the elites' dominant state. Thus, in a very real sense, a dependency relationship is a voluntary relationship. One need not argue that the elites in a dependent states are consciously betraying the interest of their poor. The elites sincerely believe that the key to economic development lies in the following prescription of liberal economic doctrine. 9.6. The policy implication of dependency analysis. If one accepts the analysis of dependency theory, then the questions of how poor country economies development becomes quite different from the traditional questions concerning comparative advantage, capital accumulation, and import and export strategies. Some of the most important new issues include: 1. The success of the advanced industrial economics does not serve as a model for the currently developing economics. When economic development became a focused area of study, the analytical strategy and ideological preference was quite clear. All nations need to emulate the patterns used by the rich countries. See Unit 10 for more details on growth theories and its critics. Indeed, in 1950s and 1960s, there was a paradigmatic consensus that growth strategies were universally applicable, a consensus best articulated by Walt Rostow in his book, The Stages of Economic Growth. Dependency theorists suggest that the success of the richer countries was a highly contingent and specific episode in global economic history, one dominated by the highly exploitative colonial relationships of the European powers. A repeat of those relationships is not now highly likely for the poor countries of the world. Dependency theory repudiates the central distributive mechanism of the neoclassical modern, what is usually called trickle-down economics. Neoclassical model of economic growth pays relatively little attention to the question of distribution of wealth. Its primary concern is the efficient production and assume that the market will allocate the rewards of efficient production in a rational and unbiased manner. This assumption may be valid for a well-integrated economically fluid economy where people can quickly adjust to economic changes and when consumption patterns are not distorted by non-economic forces such as racial, ethnic, or gender bias. These conditions are not pervasive in the developing economies, and dependency theorists argue that economic activity is not as easily disseminated in poor economics. For these structural reasons, dependency theorists argue that the market alone is not a sufficient distributive mechanism. 4. Since the market only rewards productivity, dependency theorists discount aggregate measures of economic growth such as the GDP or trade indices. Dependency theorists do not deny the economic activity occurs within a dependent state. They do make a very important distinction, however, between economic growth and economic development. For example, there is a greater concerns with the dependency framework for whether the economic activity is actually benefiting the nation as a whole. Therefore, far greater attention is paid to indices such as life expectancy, literacy, infant mortality, education, and the like. Dependency theorists clearly emphasize social indicators far more than economic indicators. Dependent states, therefore, should attempt to pursue policies of self-reliance, contrary to the neoclassical model endorsed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Greater integration into the global economy is not necessarily a good choice for poor countries. Often this policy perspective is used as an endorsement of a policy or the autarky, and there have been some experiments which such policies such as China's Great Leap Forward or Tanzania's policy of Ujamaa. The failures of these policies are clear, and the failures suggest that the autarky is not a good choice. Rather, a policy of self-reliance should be interpreted as endorsing a policy of controlled interactions with the world economy. Poor countries should only endorse interactions on terms that promise to improve the social and economic welfare of the larger citizenry. 9.7 Critics of dependency theory. Dependency theorists have provided an alternative approach looking at the unlinear growth models. They have critically evaluated the country to unequal relationship between countries, which have their history partly in colonization and imperialism. While the dependency theorists have provided a welcome critique from the south around about the north, they were not without some shortcomings and critiques. The principal criticism of dependency theories have been that the school does not provide any substantive empirical evidences to support its argument. There are few examples that are provided, but many expectations are there in which do not fit with their core periphery theory, like the newly emerged industrial countries of Southeast Asia. It has also been said that dependency theorists are highly abstract and tend to use homogenizing categories such as development and underdeveloped, which do not fully capture the variation within these categories. Another point of criticism is that the dependency school considers ties with the multinational corporations as determinal, while one view has been that they are important means of transfer of technology. Another criticism which is leveled against the dependency theorist is that they base their arguments on received notions such as nation state, capitalism, and industrialism. Some of the ecocentric biases are inherited in these theories of dependency school. For example, they assume that the industrialization and possession of industrial capital are crucial requests for economic progress. There is an inability to think beyond the state as the primary and essential agent of economic development. Also, there is a Eurocentric bias in overlooking or de-emphasizing of political undertaken by women, and in not realizing the hazardous implication of the environment of industrialization and overexploitation of resources. A singular criticism which is charged against the dependency theory is that they do not reflect the changed socioeconomics and political situations of the contemporary world. While many of the criticism are justified, what we need to ask ourselves is whether the essential ideas and the ideology behind the dependency theory has any relevance in the present context. 9.8 The relevance of dependency theories. Increasing globalization, which appears an inevitable social condition and the process, has pointed out to the interconnected nature of the world today. Never has there been so much flow of capital, finances, goods, people, ideas, and so on. Some of these interconnections had been pointed out by the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean in 1950s, and by dependency theorists later include the world system theorist. Both theorists view the problems of underdevelopment and development within a global context as interconnected economic, political, and social process. Dependency theory forecasts that the world system will tend to concentrate production in the hands of relatively few transactional corporations, making the world an oligopolic market. For this, the theory also forecasts a long trend to slow down production and so to speed up income polarization. The economic divide and income gap between industrialized countries and developing countries has widened continually. The polarization between North and South is more pronounced than ever. The United Nations Human Development Report 1997 shows that the share of the world trade for 48 least developed nations, presenting 10% of the world's population, has halved in the past 2 decades. There is a widening gap between the rich and the poor, as these figures show. The share in the global income of the poorest 20% of the world's people has fallen from 2.3% in 1960 to 1.4% in 1991 to a current level of 1.1%, while the ratio of the income of the top 20% to that of the poorest 20% rose from 30:1 in 1960 to 60:1 in 1991, and grew still further to a figure of 78.1 in 1994. In other words, the rich are getting richer and while the poor are getting poorer. This trend shows no signs of slowing down, even though the United Nations estimates in the Human Development Report that it will take only 1% of the global income and around 2 to 3% of the national income in all but the most impoverished countries to fund a program to eliminate world poverty. These figures call attention to the fact that These growing disparities between poor people and nations have to be accounted for and analyzed. Since the aim of uneven development, dependence theories of the world system theory has been to account for the international policy economy, which is an interconnected world. There is a reason to examine these theories for their rationale. Though on the face of it, they do not seem to be reflecting contemporary circumstances and situations, and some of their formulations have been questioned. However, in the face of growing interconnected economies and policy economy, it is worthwhile to critically evaluate the theories. Group of countries: industrialist countries, sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Middle East and North Africa, Latin America and Caribbean, East Asia and Pacific. 1960, 1970 and 1980, 1999. The GDP as percentage of aggregate GDP for 156 market economics. So, source of World Development Indicators and World Development Report, several years. Reflections and Action 9.2. Do you think the dependency theory can be used to explain the internal disparities in a nation? Most development theorists think that the state interventions are very important for the development of a nation. Do you agree with that? If you do you think, therefore, that the role of the state is undermined by powerful transactional corporations and agencies such as IMF and World Bank, who are known to influence state policies? 9.9 Dependency Theory and Overview. Apart from all its methodological and definitional deficiencies, dependency theory has been empirically undermined by the recent historical experience of many less developed countries. Those who may still hold its fundamental premise that underdevelopment is a process that perpetuates economic backwardness rather than a condition from which less developed countries can escape, simply choose the ignore recent economic history. However, it has been contended here that the dependency is useful in the limited essence that it offers an international policy economy framework for understanding underdevelopment. Economics alone cannot account for many of the factors that restrict economic and social progress. A reference to political economic dynamics in both domestic and international arenas is necessary. Dependency analysis rightly emphasizes the interdependence of economic and political relations in the international arena. If the political and economic dynamics it spells out are often mistaken, at least it gets the frame of reference right. In the final analysis, the study of underdevelopment is patiently incomplete if we see the world through economic lenses alone. After 50 years of development experience since the discipline of development economics was born, scholars are increasingly coming in terms with the reality that underdevelopment is the result of the bewildering era of factors, not only economic and political, but also social, cultural, etc. We can say retrospectively that the dependency movement was simply to intellectually ambitious in seeking to account for underdevelopment with a general theory of political economy. As one of the pioneers of development theory, Albert Hirschman wrote 30 years ago, the attempt to produce general statements about the relationship between politics and economics is likely to produce only banality and frustration. For relationships at this level are either evident and hence uninteresting, or are so complex and depend on so many other variables as to be unpredictable and inconclusive. It would be difficult to phrase more succinctly what has doomed dependency theory to the dustbin of history. Globalization means that Latin American economics are subjected to the discipline of international financial market as well as the threat of exit by local and international investors. Dependency theories would predictably use this insight to validate their thinking by asserting that global economic integration restricts the room for maneuver of many governments in matters, physical and monetary. While this is undeniable, reduced freedom of policy action is not necessarily deleterious for development. In fact, many economics assert that the new discipline imposed on developing nations by international markets has weeded out the worst examples of irresponsible populist policies of time passed by trying politicians' hand. The international economic scene is quite different from when dependency tenets were first being formulated in the 1950s and 1960s, but again, it is up to Latin America's governments to take advantage of the new opportunities and to limit the new risks that come with this new world economic landscape. Their policies given them some leverage as to the extent to which they want to control their individual economic destiny. That is the good news. Dependency theory, in a more pessimistic fashion, did not allow for the possibility. 9-10 Conclusion. In this unit, we have learned that dependency theories have a recent origin. It was developed during the middle of 20th century in Latin America, mainly as a critique of modernization theories. They rejected the arguments of modernization theories that modernity and development reach bottom most in its own due course. They argued that the economic activities in the richer countries often led to serious economic problems in the poorer countries. Here we have tried to define dependency theory and examine the social context that lead to the origin of dependency theory. We have also seen the central propositions of dependency theory and how this explain the causes and continuance of underdevelopment in the contemporary world. Finally, the major critiques against dependency theory and the relevance in this globalization era are also analyzed in the unit. 9.11 Further reading. The development of underdevelopment. In Cochrot, James B. Dependence and Underdevelopment. From S. Lal, is dependency a useful concept in analyzing underdevelopment? World Development, Volume 3. So this is the end of the chapter. Thank you very much.